Hello, church. Recently on a lunch break, I tried to take a break from all the news. I typically watch the news or listen to the news in the midday hour, and obviously we've been saturated with all the corona information coming in, and so I decided to take a little break from all that, tuned into my favorite sports show, and listened to the individuals talking there about things. We're going through sport withdrawal here in America, really throughout the world. But I thought I might get a break from all the corona stuff, and of course I didn't, because even on sports channels, that's what they're discussing. And one of the individuals at that time made the statement that he feels 9 months from now there would be a baby boom. He then proceeded to say 12 months from now the divorce rates would spike. And at first glance, listening to that, it would appear that he was trying to be comical. But he did not show a smile, did not make a smirk, and you realized in listening to the program that he wasn't joking at all. He believed that there would be a spike in divorce rates. And unfortunately, he's probably correct. We are now living in a day and age that's unprecedented from the standpoint that we've been ordered to stay at home. We've been ordered to stay at home for an unprecedented amount of time. There have been lockdowns throughout the world, natural disasters. People have been told to stay inside, given hurricanes and earthquakes and things. There's been some civil unrest, of course, in our history. But to be told to stay inside, to be told to stay at home, to be told to stay at home for this long, it is unprecedented. I'm not familiar with a time in our history where it's been this way, and maybe it has. Obviously, before my lifetime, it's been nothing I've experienced before. But being home together, which would normally be a good thing, this actually is going to prove challenging for many couples. Maybe you've already experienced that yourself, or you know people that have experienced that. Usually we want to get off of work. We want to get some time away from work, and we want to go home and be with our family. People all the time are at work. They just can't wait till they get home, or they can't wait till that vacation week comes. But now it's different. Now we're being told we have to stay home, and we're told we have to stay home for a long time, and it really has changed everything for our way of life. And you throw kids into the mix. If you have children that you don't typically homeschool, now they're home from school. They're supposed to be learning. And you have mom and dad or husband and wife and all the children in a home, either working or not working, for a long time. And this will be a strain on many relationships. It will be a strain on many couples. Crisis, one like we're going through now, it does bring tension. It does bring problems. It brings challenges to relationships. It brings challenges in particular to couples. Right now, our country is going through all kinds of concerns. There's going to be stress in a home and a relationship due to the economic hardship that people are experiencing. A lot of folks are unemployed. The financial equation for life right now is in the air. Will the economy survive this? And what does that look like for us? Can we pay the bills? And how will it look like for our jobs? Will there be jobs to go back to? So there's stress in a marriage, in a home, due to the economic losses. There's going to be stress in a home because of the loss of separation. And by that I mean couples are used to going to work and then coming back and being with each other, or going somewhere and coming back to be with each other. Now there is not that time of separation. And that may sound opposite to what a marriage needs, but in many cases, we do look forward to that separation, that time to be away from each other, because absence makes the heart grow fonder. And so we lack that separation, the financial hardships that come into play, the emotional turmoil that this crisis is putting on each of us. There are a lot of anxieties. There's a lot of fears associated with this crisis. Then you have the parental duties and the frustrations that husbands and wives, mothers and fathers experience. If everybody's home, including the kids, in many cases, the life for a mom changes drastically, while the life for a father doesn't, or at least in his mind. It's still mom's job or the wife's job to do all the home things, while the husband's life doesn't change much. And that leads to frustration in a marriage. So there are a lot of things that impact the marriage of today's crisis. Even just the lack of routine. the lack of going where you typically go, doing what you typically do. It may be to the gym, it may be to the coffee shop, it may be to see certain people, it may be to do certain things, even just not going to church on a regular basis. There are a lot of things that throw our routine out of whack, and here we are with all kinds of changes that we didn't approve, we didn't call for. It just entered our life really in the blink of an eye. And here we are. Fear and anxiety are the biggest two factors to the stress that relationships will deal with right now. With anxiety of medical concerns, physical things, health, with fears of uncertainty for the future and what that holds, that leads us to act and behave very emotional. Fear puts the nervous system into high gear. And then when we're stressed and we're tense because of that fear, we don't typically perform at our greatest level when it comes to the people we love. We tend to act very emotional. We tend to overreact. We tend to lash out. We tend to respond critically or defensively. So these fears and these anxieties are going to impact couples. And as a pastor, I'm always concerned with the state of relationships within our congregation. I long to see husbands and wives and young couples who are growing in their love to be close, to stay close, because I believe the strength of a church, the strength of a family, the strength of a culture, the strength of a country, it does rest on the strength of that important sacred relationship between a man and a woman. And because of that concern that I have right now, and knowing that we're going to be at least in our homes for another few weeks, if not longer, most probably longer, I wanted to share with you just one phrase in the Gospel of Luke that I hope will be a help to you, that will get you to think about how you should or shouldn't treat each other in these coming days and weeks. I want you to survive without question, and I want you to thrive. I want you to do better because of this crisis and be prepared for any future crisis that may come our way, that most probably will come our way. Life is full of trouble. Job, we read in the book of Job that man is born into trouble as the sparks fly upward. So crises will come to us, and we as couples need to be prepared to handle that. What's that phrase you're asking? It's a simple phrase. Jesus said, remember Lot's wife. Remember Lot's wife. And he was referring to Lot's wife back in the book of Genesis, but he was applying that to a future prophecy, in particular, the return of Christ. Now, that phrase gives us a lot of liberty in remembering Lot's wife. We can remember it within the context that Jesus wants us to remember it in, and that has to do with materialism. That has to do with looking at the things in this world instead of looking at the things above this world. But we can remember Lot's wife even in the context of the present pandemic, the crisis that we're going through. It's in the book of Genesis, and in particular in chapter 19, if you'd like to look at it. But I want you to think about the demise of Lot's wife, because that's what Jesus was referring to. When he said, remember Lot's wife, he was referring to what happened to her at the end. Her demise was really Lot's demise. Her demise was the demise of her marriage with Lot, not just her life. And when she became a pillar of salt, not only did Lot lose his wife, but Lot lost his family. You see, it was right after Lot's wife turned to a pillar of salt that he and his daughters ended up in a place they shouldn't have been in. And unfortunately, incest was the result. And so everything went south and downward upon that moment. Lot's wife and Lot, they were in a crisis. That's why I bring in this phrase to you this evening. Lot and his wife were living life well. Everything was going well where they were. He was a politician. It seems to me that they had the money that they needed. Jesus even referred to the time in which they were living in Luke chapter 17, saying they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. So life was going very well for everyone in Sodom. But unfortunately, corruption had taken hold on the city. There was great wickedness. God saw it. God was not happy with it. And so God sentenced that city to destruction. But because Lot, Abraham's nephew, was a righteous man, God sent angels to deliver Lot and his wife and his family out of that city before it was destroyed. So while life was going fine and hunky-dory for Lot and his wife, they had plans. They maybe had plans to retire, vacation. Their health was good. They got a knock on the door, and they were told, your life is about to change forever. This city is going to be destroyed. All the plans you had, set them aside. You need to leave and flee this city before it's destroyed by God with fire and brimstone. So everything changed in a moment. What a shocker it was for them to have everything in place and to all of a sudden be told it's going to all mean nothing because something came into your life unexpected, something unwanted, and it's going to change your future. Change the way you do things. Change the way you behave, where you live. And Lot and his wife, unfortunately, were not prepared for that. We're only given a brief snapshot into this couple and into their crisis. There's not a lot of detail given to the story, but the important part in the story is what happened at the end. Lot went and told his sons-in-law. He tried to convince them to come with him and his wife and his 2 daughters to leave the city before it's destroyed. And it's interesting, they were forced to stay at home because of an angry mob in their crisis. And they were preparing for an uncertain future in many ways as far as how it would impact them. They knew what the city would look like, but they didn't know how it would impact them. And the crisis has similar characteristics to our crisis today. And that is the future is uncertain. And we are told to stay at home, and it came out of nowhere. And I hope that your response to it, your approach to this crisis will be very different than Lot and his wife, because they failed to address it together. They failed to address it together. In Genesis chapter 19, verse number 26, we read these tragic words. After Lot was told to get out, he hesitated. The angels urged him and actually drew him out of the city. Lot and his 2 daughters and his wife all got out of the city in haste because of God's judgment. But verse 26 tells us that Lot's wife looked back from behind him and she became a pillar of salt. What insight from just a few words. We're told that she looked back at Sodom, but we're told she looked back at Sodom from behind Lot, meaning he was leading his daughters and his wife out of the city. She was behind him, and because he wasn't looking at her, because he wasn't conscious of where she stood at that moment, she felt she had the liberty and the privacy of that moment to look back at Sodom. And you say, well, what's the big deal with that? Well, the angels told him, you need to get out of Sodom, and they specifically said, don't look back. They all knew this was a command, essentially, from God. In his deliverance, he only asked that they not look back at Sodom. And Lot's wife did that. And she did that behind Lot's back. You say, why did she look back? Her disobedience was devastating for her. It was devastating for her marriage. It was devastating for her family. Why did she look back? Well, she looked back for 2 reasons. She looked back, number one, because it was harder for her to look back than it was for Lot. It was harder for her not to look back than it was for Lot. And we'll explain this in just a moment. He wasn't that torn as she was. He wasn't that connected as she was. And so it was harder for her not to look back. It was harder for her to obey that command. And then number 2, she looked back because Lot was too preoccupied with his life than he was with her life. Crisis always brings challenges to relationships. Crises, as many that come, they're always going to bring challenges to relationships. And that's primarily because husbands approach crises different than wives. Women approach problems and tragedies and crises different than men do. We all approach it differently. We all handle crises a little differently. Some of us binge on the news stations. Some of us know when to turn the channel off. Some of us proactively prepare for crises, and some of us take a more passive approach. Some of us are more intent about it, to try to solve it. Others of us aren't that way. So we all look at it differently. We all approach it differently. But most of the time, the way we handle crisis hinges on our gender. And there are certainly exceptions to this, without question. I don't want to generalize all of the relationships in the world. But most of us behave like men if we're men, and most of us behave like women if we're women. Sometimes it's a little different, but most of the times, no matter how we are formed as personalities or what we do as individuals, we're still usually very different from each other in a relationship. It's very rare that two different people, two distinct people, do the same things, think the same way, and behave the same way. And in times of crisis, we approach it differently. That's just part of human nature. It's a part of our life. Now, one of us in the marriage, one of us in the relationships tend to be more concerned about crisis than the other. One of us tends to be more fearful than the other. One of us tends to be more emotional than the other. One of us tends to be more involved than the other. And if we're going to come through our present crisis or any future crisis as couples, then we need to be very sensitive to the person we love. We need to be very conscious of the mindset and the perspective of the person God has blessed us with. Understand this, couples. Different approaches does not mean right or wrong approaches. Different mindsets doesn't necessarily mean good or bad mindsets. Now, yes, in a marriage, in a relationship, you have two different perspectives, two different approaches, and one of them could be wrong, and one of them could be right. But more than often, both have elements of right thinking, and both have elements of wrong thinking. But they are very, very different. And if we're going to get through this crisis, especially that we're stuck at home together, we've got to take the time to learn how the other person is thinking, to care about how the other person is viewing this, and to be sensitive to that, to not declare the other person wrong because they don't think like you, to not declare the other person crazy or insane because they don't have the same mindset, the same perspective as you do. In particular, gender, God has designed marriage intentionally to complete us. A man's mindset, although it is strong in some areas, it is weak in other areas. It is incomplete. A woman's mindset, again, there's strength in parts of it and weaknesses in parts of it. It's incomplete. When you take a man's mindset and a woman's mindset and lay them down together, you will get a more complete picture of life. You'll have a better perspective, a better approach, a better vantage point. I remember when I was in grade school, and this may be dating me a little bit for some of the younger audience, but we had transparencies. I don't think they do that today. I think everything's projection by PowerPoint and presentations on the computer. But back when I went to school, they would put a transparency down on a projector, and then you could see, for example, the human skeletal structure. You could see all the bones. And then they would put another transparency on top of that one, and that would fill in the rest of the human anatomy, the muscles and the organs. I've seen this in books, especially for kids, science books, the dinosaur bone structure or the dinosaur skin structure, scales. But basically you take two pictures that are transparent, lay them over each other, and you get a more complete picture. This is what happens when a man and a woman come together and they share their perspectives rather than argue their perspectives. They share their perspectives rather than choose one is right and one is wrong. God wants us to see the world truly through both perspectives because we're both very different. The world should never be seen just in blue. It should never be seen just in pink. It really needs to be seen in purple, a combination of those two colors. When we fail to listen to the perspective of each other, we fail to see the perspective of each other. And when we fail to see the perspective of each other, we fail to get a bigger picture of what life is all about. And even more importantly, in the context of relationships and couples, when we fail to listen to understand, and to see the perspective of the person we're in a relationship with, we're communicating to them that how they feel, that how they see, doesn't matter as much as how I see or as how I feel. And when we give somebody the perspective, or rather the impression, that we don't care about how they feel or how they think, right or wrong, then we're giving them the impression we don't care about them. That's when relationships start to crumble. And again, in the situation we're in now with COVID-19, already in China, I read an article recently that divorce rates are already spiking. People are already spending a lot of time with each other, and during a high stressful, high intensity time, they're learning about each other. They're learning that they typically don't mean that much to the other person. People are inherently self-centered right now, and that is communicating the wrong things to the people that they love. Now, let's get back to Lot and his wife before we close. You say, why didn't Lot look back? Why did Lot's wife look back? Why didn't Lot look back? Well, two things for me stand out in the passage. Because he's a man, I believe, number one, he didn't look back because he was focused on preserving his life. Men tend to be very selfish. That's why Paul told us husbands to love our wives even as ourselves, as Jesus loved the church and gave himself for it. We tend to be very selfish. When it comes to food, our first thought is feeding our belly, not the people around us. So I think he didn't look back because he didn't want to get killed. He didn't want to lose his life. He was focused on himself. Secondly, as a man, Lot didn't look back because at the moment he was very task-oriented. Men are task-oriented. And in that moment, he was focused on doing what he was told to do, which is to save his family. And so he was getting out of Dodge. He was saving his family. Of course, he was saving himself, but he was doing what he needed to do, and he needed to complete that task. That's how men typically are, as a generalization. Why did Lot's wife look back? Well, she looked back for two different reasons. As a woman, again, generalizing, typically, women are not nearly as selfish as men when it comes to saving themselves. That's why when they sit down to eat, they'll dish up for their husband or they'll dish up for their children. So she was looking back because she was focused not on saving her own life. She was looking back to Sodom because she was focused on the lives of the children that she left behind. She had adult children who did not come with them. And while Lot could get out of Dodge to save his own skin, Lot's wife looked back, I believe, because she looked back to see the loss of her children's life. It was different, a different perspective. Lot wasn't sensitive to that. The second reason why Lot's wife looked back, I believe, is because women tend to be more relationship-focused and oriented than task-oriented. Men tend to be task-oriented. Women tend to be relationship-oriented. So she was looking back at the relationships. She was looking back at everything she lost. Men can look towards the future, I think, in general, a little better than women can. They can see something to go for. Women have a hard time getting past the past. In this case, losing everything she worked for. Her home was the way she wanted it. The neighborhood was the way she wanted it. And again, her children and friends were back there. And so very different approaches that impacted why Lot looked forward and Lot's wife looked backward. At the end of the day, the tragedy of the story is Lot and his wife did not take the time to get to understand each other, to get to know each other's perspective in time of crisis, and they didn't do what they needed to do to form their two mindsets, bring them together so that they could get through the crisis together. Their marriage didn't survive their crisis, and it didn't survive because they didn't learn each other. Lot could have been a big help to Lot's wife, and Lot's wife could have been a big help to Lot, and the two of them could have gotten out of Sodom, and they could have continued their family in a pure way. But unfortunately, their marriage ended, and the family turned to incest and alcohol, tragically. I'd like to conclude this time by reading 1 Peter chapter 3, just a few verses that pertains to relationships. And in verse number 1, Peter starts by saying likewise, meaning he's referring to a previous discussion. And chapter 2 is all about servants and being a servant. So he wants to continue this idea of serving one another. And he turns to marriage, where we should be serving one another. So he says in verse number 1, likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands. Meaning, you need to know what they believe. You need to know how they feel before you can even be in subjection to them, before you can even submit to them. You have to take the time to listen to them, give them a platform to speak. Learn to digest what they're saying. Don't correct them, don't fix them, don't tell them why they're right or wrong, but listen to them so you can be in subjection to your own husbands, and not to the news anchor, not to the doctor, not to the pastor, not to the financial advisor, but be in subjection to your own husbands. Ladies, your husband should be the most important person in your life, God being only more important, of course. So Peter says, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by the conversation of the wives. While they, husbands, behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear. Now that's a reference to your manner of life, what they see in you. Verse number 3, don't focus on the adorning of the outward adorning of the plaiting of the hair and of wearing of gold or of putting on of apparel, but focus, verse 4, on the hidden man of the heart, in that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. So he's telling ladies, be sensitive to your husbands. Ultimately, know how they feel, get to learn about them so that you can be in subjection to them and behave yourself in a very quiet and meek manner, which will ultimately really facilitate a good marriage and help your husband in his role as a husband. Verse number 7 of the passage, Peter says, likewise, just as they want the ladies to serve their husbands, Peter says they want you guys to serve your wives. Likewise, ye husbands, listen now, dwell with them according to knowledge. You're dwelling with your wife if you're unemployed right now. You're dwelling with your wife more than expected if you're working from home. But you should be dwelling with your wife even more than usual because of the stay-at-home order. In general, dwell with them, but dwell with them according to knowledge. Get to know your wife's mindset. Get to know your wife's feelings. Get to know your wife's emotions. Get to know them, and that takes a good ear. It takes time. Take some walks, turn the TV off, and talk. Start the campfire up and talk and listen to your wife. Dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife, meaning respect her feelings, respect her opinion, respect her perspective. She comes at this from a whole different angle than you do. She has a whole different vantage point. She probably is thinking a lot more about your children than you are. She probably is thinking a lot more about the resources in your home than you are. She's probably thinking about other relationships, and she has just a different mindset. So give honor to her as you listen to her. Peter says, as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. So Peter's saying, serve each other, be respectful of each other, get to know each other, and then he says in verse 8, finally, referring to wives and husbands, be all of one mind. Take those thoughts, take the different perspectives, take the differences of mindset, bring it together and have one mind, one perspective. It's two becoming one. That's where you have strength. That's where you take your weaknesses, what you're missing, and fill in those gaps due to your spouse or to your prospective other. Verse number 8, finally, be all of one mind, having compassion one of another. Love as brethren, he writes. Be pitiful, be courteous. You may not agree with how your spouse or your prospective other feels about something, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. That doesn't mean it's bad even. Maybe they have a fear or an anxiety attached to something that you don't. That's where you need to have compassion on them and be pitiful that you don't have that and that they do. Ultimately, be courteous. Take their feelings into account. Verse 9, not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing, in case the conversation goes south, or in case they take offense to a statement you make or response you have. Don't give them evil for their evil. Don't give them railing for their railing. Instead, Peter says, but contrariwise, blessing, knowing that ye are thereunto called, that ye should inherit a blessing. I urge you that through this crisis, you take biblical principles, apply them to your relationship with your husband or wife, so that through this crisis, you get closer and you're not torn apart. That you unlike Lot and his wife, can come through this marriage better, stronger, not broken, but actually closer. And so I urge you during this time, as Jesus put the words, remember Lot's wife. God bless you.